The deed arrived in Bernard Abbott's hands on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, folded inside a leather satchel that smelled of tobacco and trail dust, and the moment he unfolded it, he understood that he had just purchased something far more complicated than land. Bernard had ridden into the town of Caldwell, Kansas, the way most men came through trailing ambition and a quiet kind of loneliness that had no name yet. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of river stone after rain. He had spent the better part of a decade working cattle drives, saving every dollar that didn't get swallowed by card tables or whiskey, and by the winter of 1877, he had enough to do what he had always told himself he would do. He would stop moving. He would buy something that couldn't be taken from him on the back of a horse. The land broker in Caldwell was a sweaty little man named Percy Grimes, who operated out of a converted storeroom on the main street, surrounded by stacked ledgers and the persistent smell of ink. Percy had shown Bernard 3 properties over the course of 2 days, a dry plot north of town with no water rights, a parcel that shared a fence line with a neighbor who had already shot 2 people over that very fence, and the third one. The third one was different. Langston Farm, Percy had said, spreading the deed across his desk with something that wasn't quite a smile. 412 acres along Bluff Creek. Good soil, decent timber stand along the eastern ridge, a working well and a farmhouse that's been maintained. Owner owes back taxes to the county and owes the rest to Silas Greer. Bernard had looked at the name on the deed. Naomi Langston. What happened to her? He had asked, and Percy had shrugged with the particular indifference of a man who processed human ruin as clerical matter. Husband died 2 winters back. Fever. Left her with the land and the debts. She's been holding on, but Silas is calling in the note. Land goes to auction if no one buys the debt paper and the tax lien by end of the month. You buy both, you own the mortgage. She can pay you off or she can vacate. Bernard had not thought too much about Naomi Langston at that moment. He had been thinking about water rights and soil grade and the eastern timber stand. He had been thinking about the number of acres and the figure Percy was quoting, which was fair by anyone's standard. He had signed the papers that afternoon, paid the combined sum of the back taxes and the Silas Greer note from the fold of cash he kept in an oilskin inside his coat, and by sundown he had ridden out toward Bluff Creek with the deed and the mortgage papers in his saddlebag. He had not expected the farmhouse to have smoke rising from its chimney. He had not expected the garden along the south side of the house, which was already turned and planted in neat rows despite the lateness of the hour, and the chill still clinging to the April air. He had not expected the pair of mended curtains visible through the window, or the way the fence posts had been recently restrung with wire that caught the last of the evening light, and he had absolutely not expected the woman who stepped onto the porch with a Winchester rifle leveled at his chest before he had even finished dismounting. "I don't know who you are," she said, "but you are on private property, and I suggest you tell me your business before I decide it isn't worth hearing." Bernard stood very still with his hands slightly raised. He had been in situations that threatened worse than this, but something about the steadiness in her voice made him take it seriously. She wasn't shaking. Her eyes were fixed and clear and dark as strong coffee, and her jaw was set in a way that told him she had made decisions before and carried them through. "My name is Bernard Abbott," he said carefully. "I bought the mortgage note and the tax lien on this property from Percy Grimes today. I have the papers in my saddlebag if you'd like to see them." The rifle did not lower immediately. She studied him for a long moment, and in that moment Bernard studied her too. Naomi Langston was perhaps 28 years old, with dark brown hair pinned back under practical circumstances, and a face that was striking in its lack of artifice strong features, a mouth that looked like it had laughed often and recently stopped, and the kind of sun-touched complexion that came from working land, not sitting in parlors. She wore a plain work dress and boots that had seen considerable use, and she stood with her feet planted on that porch as though she had grown there. "Show me," she said finally. He moved slowly, deliberately to his saddlebag, retrieved the papers, and walked them to the base of the porch steps. She came down 2 steps and took them from his hand without letting the rifle barrel drift by more than an inch. She read them in the fading light, her eyes moving quickly across the pages. When she finished, she looked up at him with an expression that was utterly unreadable. "So you own my debt now," she said. "I own the paper, yes. What do you intend to do with it?" Bernard had come out here thinking he would say something straightforward. He would explain the terms, give her a reasonable window to pay or make arrangements, and see what was workable. But standing at the foot of those porch steps, looking at a woman who had clearly been fighting for this place every single day and who had not wavered by so much as a flinch, he found himself saying something slightly different from what he had planned. "I haven't decided yet," he said. "I thought I should introduce myself first." Naomi lowered the rifle. Not all the way, she rested the barrel against her shoulder rather than pointing it anywhere, but it was movement. "There's a barn around back," she said. "Your horse can stay there tonight. You can sleep in it. In the morning we will talk about what comes next." It was not a welcome exactly, but it wasn't a refusal either. The barn was clean and dry, and Bernard's horse, a rangy chestnut gelding he called Porter, took to it immediately. Bernard lay in the hay with his hat over his face and listened to the wind come off the plains and thought about the fact that he had, in the span of one afternoon, considerably complicated his own plans. In the morning she made coffee. She did not invite him inside, but she brought a cup out to the barn, knocked on the door frame with 2 knuckles, and set the cup on the post when he opened the door. The coffee was strong and real, not the thin stuff you got in cattle camp, and it told him something about how she ran things even when things were hard. They sat on opposite sides of the fence that ran between the barn lot and the south field, and she laid out the situation with the directness of someone who had already done the math 100 times and was tired of flinching from the numbers. Her husband, Thomas Langston, had died of typhoid fever in the winter of 1876. He had taken out a loan from Silas Greer, who ran the lending operation out of the back of the general store in Caldwell, to expand the cattle operation in the year before his illness. The cattle had not expanded fast enough. Thomas had died. The note had come due that past November, and Naomi had paid what she could and tried to negotiate the rest, but Silas Greer was not a man who negotiated when he smelled blood. "I have 22 head of cattle still," she said. "Good stock, most of them. I have the garden. I have a wheat plot I'm putting in this season. I had a hand, an older man named Earl, who helped me through last year, but he moved on to his daughter's place in Abilene in February. I have been managing alone since then." Bernard looked out at the 412 acres that stretched in front of them, green with spring grass and bisected by the glittering thread of Bluff Creek. It was, he thought, genuinely beautiful land, the kind of land a person could build something on if they had the time and the energy and the stubbornness to see it through. "I'm not here to take it from you," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You will forgive me if I don't simply accept that on your word." "Fair enough," he said. "I'll prove it some other way." He proved it first by staying. He had no particular other place to be, and the truth was that the farm presented itself to him with a kind of immediate logic. It needed work he knew how to do, and he had the resources and the time to do it. He offered her a straightforward arrangement, spoken across that fence with the morning sun climbing behind them. He would work the farm alongside her through the spring and summer. In exchange for his labor, he would require no payment toward the mortgage note. At the end of the season, they would assess the crop and cattle profit, and if it was sufficient to make a reasonable payment, she could begin paying down the note on her own terms. If she chose to buy him out of the mortgage entirely, he would accept fair value and move on. Naomi had listened to this without expression. Then she had said, "And if the season is poor, then we figure out something else," he said. "But I don't think it'll be poor." She had looked at him for a long moment, and he had held her gaze without difficulty, because there was nothing in his proposal he was ashamed of. Finally, she had nodded once, the way a person agrees to a contract they are still mentally auditing. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "I'll feed you at the house. You start in the west field this morning. The fencing needs reposting along the creek bend." That was the beginning of it. The first weeks were all business. Bernard worked with the single-minded efficiency of a man who had spent years perfecting the execution of hard physical tasks, and Naomi quickly recognized that he was not performing competence but simply expressing it. He restrung the west field fencing in 2 days. He repaired the barn roof before the April rains arrived, which saved the hay store completely. He helped her with the spring planting, and while he was not a farmer by original trade, he learned quickly and applied himself with the kind of quiet intensity that she found, after a while, not irritating but rather steadying. He was also, she noticed, careful about the lines between them. He did not impose himself on her mornings or her evenings. He ate at her table because she had offered it, but he always waited to be told to sit, always offered to help clear, and never made assumptions about her comfort with his presence. He talked when she asked him something, but he did not fill silences the way insecure men did. He could work beside her for an entire afternoon with nothing between them but the sound of the land and the wind, and it felt, she was surprised to discover, not awkward but companionable. Her closest neighbor, a woman named Ruth Caldecott who lived 4 miles south and drove up twice a month with the stubbornness of someone who had decided friendship was not optional, made her opinion clear on the 3rd visit after Bernard's arrival. Ruth was 52, broad, cheerful, and absolutely unafraid of saying what she saw. "He's a good-looking man," Ruth said, standing in the kitchen while Naomi rolled pie crust. "And from what I can see, he knows how to work. Where'd he come from?" "He bought my mortgage," Naomi said flatly. Ruth was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, "and now he's fixing your fence posts. And the barn roof." "Naomi." "Ruth. I'm just saying that a man who buys a woman's debt and then shows up to work it off himself is a man who is interested in more than the land value." Naomi pressed the rolling pin harder than necessary. "He is a man who made a business arrangement and is honoring it." Ruth helped herself to a piece of dried apple from the bowl on the counter and said nothing else on the subject, but her expression said everything she was choosing not to. The truth was that Naomi had thought about it. She was not naive, and she was not blind, and she had too much honest practicality in her to pretend that she hadn't noticed things about Bernard Abbott that had nothing to do with fence posts or crop yields. She had noticed the way he listened when she talked, not the polite half-attention of someone waiting their turn, but actual listening, the kind that made her feel as though the things she said mattered in some specific and irreplaceable way. She had noticed the way he laughed, which was rare but genuine, a low sound that seemed to surprise him slightly when it came out. She had noticed his hands, which were scarred and capable, and which occasionally, when they reached across a work surface for a tool or a rope, passed close enough to hers to make her breath catch in a way she filed away under the category of things she was not examining. Thomas had been a good man, and she had loved him truly, and his death had left a grief in her that she still carried in the quiet parts of the night. But she was 28 years old and she was not made of stone, and whatever Bernard Abbott was doing to the calculations she had made about the rest of her life, she was aware of it, and choosing, for now, to focus on the wheat plot. It was the evening of the first week in May that things shifted. Not dramatically, nothing in their relationship moved dramatically, because they were both people who had learned to be careful with things that mattered. But it shifted. Bernard had been repairing the henhouse door, and she had come out to tell him supper was ready, and he had asked her to hold the board while he nailed it, which she did. They were standing very close together in the necessity of the task, and when the board was set and he stepped back into her slightly, just the briefest contact of his shoulder against hers, and he turned to apologize and found her face much closer than he had expected. They both stood still for a moment. "Supper," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for another 3 or 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then she turned and went inside, and he followed her, and they ate supper with the particular concentrated attention to the food that people apply when they are trying not to look at each other. After supper, while she was washing the dishes and he was sitting at the kitchen table ostensibly checking the accounts ledger she'd asked him to look over, he said without preamble, "Tell me about Thomas." She was quiet for a moment, her hands in the wash water. Then she said, "He was kind. He was not practical, not the way you are. He had ideas that were bigger than what he could execute, and he trusted people sometimes when he should not have. But he tried very hard, and he loved this land, and he was a good husband. You miss him." "Every day," she said simply. "But grief doesn't mean stopped, it just means carrying." Bernard set the ledger down. "I know something about carrying." She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "What do you carry?" He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might deflect, but he didn't. "I had a family once, a younger brother. He died on a cattle drive in 1871. A river crossing, nothing dramatic, just bad luck and a fast current. He was 19. I was the one who'd talked him into coming along." Naomi dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and came to sit across from him at the table. "How long before you stopped blaming yourself?" He looked at her steadily. "Ask me again in a few years." Something passed between them in that quiet kitchen in the lamplight, with the sound of the prairie night coming through the cracked window. Not a declaration, not a touch. Just the recognition of two people who had been shaped by loss into the particular shapes they now were, and who had discovered, unexpectedly, that those shapes fit together in some way that neither of them had anticipated. She said good night first, as she always did. He went out to the barn, as he always did. But he lay awake considerably longer than usual, and in the morning she made the coffee slightly stronger, which was either coincidence or her particular language for something she wasn't yet ready to say out loud. The trouble with Silas Greer arrived on a Wednesday in the middle of May, which was exactly the kind of day Silas Greer favored for making trouble ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day people had their guards down. He came with two men in his company, one of them a tall fellow named Lute Carver who fancied himself intimidating, and he rode up to the farmhouse in the mid-morning when the sun was high and cheerful, and seemed to deliberately contradict the nature of his business. Bernard was coming from the creek field when he saw the 3 horses tied to the porch rail. He quickened his pace without running. Naomi was on the porch, and from 50 yards he could read the set of her shoulders, which were squared against something unpleasant. Silas Greer was a fleshy man in his mid-50s with small eyes, and the manner of someone who had discovered long ago that money could substitute for every social quality he lacked. He was looking at Naomi with the particular expression of a man reviewing inventory he believed he had already purchased. "The note doesn't belong to you anymore, Silas," Naomi was saying as Bernard came up the path. Her voice was absolutely steady. "You sold it to Mr. Abbott." "Sold it to who?" Silas turned, and his small eyes found Bernard with the calculation of a man updating a ledger. "You the one who bought Grimes's paper?" "That's correct," Bernard said. He came up onto the porch and stood between Naomi and Silas without making a production of it, but deliberately. "Bernard Abbott, I hold the mortgage note and the tax lien. Is there something I can help you with?" Silas smiled, which was worse than his not smiling. "Just came to check on my investment, so to speak. Greer Lending has an interest in the properties whose notes we've sold, you understand. We like to know things are being properly maintained." "No such clause exists in the note I purchased," Bernard said. "I read every word of it." Silas's smile stayed, but something behind his eyes adjusted. "You're a careful man, Mr. Abbott. Careful enough." The two men looked at each other for a moment that was entirely about something other than what was being said. Lute Carver shifted his weight on the step in a way that was meant to remind people he was there and was large. Bernard glanced at him once with complete calm and then looked back at Silas. "I appreciate the visit," Bernard said. "Have a safe ride back to town." Silas looked past Bernard at Naomi, and his expression did something that made Bernard's jaw tighten. Then he touched his hat brim and turned and went back down the steps with Lute Carver behind him. They rode out without hurry, which was its own kind of statement. Naomi let out a breath. Bernard turned to look at her. "Has he been out here before?" "Twice," she said. "After Thomas died, before you came." She paused. "He made it known he would be willing to forgive the debt in exchange for other arrangements. I made it known what I thought of those arrangements." The anger Bernard felt was quiet and cold, which was how his anger always was. "He won't make that kind of offer again," he said. "Not while I'm here." She looked at him. "I handled it before you were here." "I know you did," he said. "I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm just saying he won't now." She studied him for a moment, and whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her because she gave a short nod. "Come inside. The bread is ready and it will go cold." 3 days after Silas Greer's visit, Bernard rode into Caldwell to file the mortgage papers properly with the county recorder, and to have a quiet conversation with Percy Grimes about the legal boundaries of Silas Greer's so-called ongoing interest in properties whose notes he had sold. Percy, when faced with a man who had read every word of the relevant documents, and who expressed himself with the unhurried precision of someone who was not afraid of the consequences of being right, conceded quickly, and in writing, that no such ongoing interest existed. Bernard also, while he was in town, stopped at the general store for supplies. He bought coffee, the good kind, and flour and salt pork, and a spool of steel wire for the fencing. And on an impulse he couldn't entirely explain to himself, he bought a small tin of cinnamon, because he had noticed that she kept a cinnamon tin on the kitchen shelf that was nearly empty, and she sometimes looked at it with the particular expression of a person mentally calculating whether they can afford to replace something small that they genuinely enjoy. When he came back and set the cinnamon on the kitchen table, she looked at it for a moment and then looked at him, and something crossed her face that was gone before he could fully read it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's not a grand gesture," he said. "Just cinnamon." "I know what it is," she said. She made cinnamon rolls the next morning, which was not her usual practice, and she put one in front of him at breakfast with absolutely no comment, and Bernard Abbott ate it with the consciousness of a man who understood that something was being communicated in a language where words had not yet been agreed upon. The wheat crop came in well. By the end of May, the field was a bright particular green that seemed to vibrate in the prairie sun, and Bernard, standing at the edge of it with Naomi beside him, felt the particular satisfaction of something growing that had been seeded with intention and attended to with care. He was aware that this was also a description of something other than wheat, and that the awareness was not something he was any longer trying to argue himself out of. They had developed over the weeks a rhythm of the days that felt natural in the way things feel natural when they have been carefully made to seem so, and have then become actually so. Mornings were work, separate and together. Midday they ate at the kitchen table. Afternoons were the longer labor of the farm. Evenings, after supper, they sat on the porch when the weather permitted and watched the light change over the Kansas plains, which changed spectacularly every evening and never exactly the same way twice. They talked about the farm, and they talked about smaller things, and sometimes they talked about larger things, and the evenings extended imperceptibly later as the weeks passed, until Bernard was sometimes staying on that porch until well after dark, with the stars enormous and indifferent above them, and neither of them in any particular hurry to end it. He told her about the cattle drives, about the Kishom Trail and the Shawnee Trail before it, about the particular character of Kansas thunderstorms seen from the back of a horse in open country, about the men he had known and ridden with, some of them good and some of them not. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had been a school teacher, and who had given her an education that the other girls in her county had not received, which had turned out to be both a blessing and a source of friction in ways that still surprised her when she thought about it. She told him about coming to Kansas with Thomas, who had seen the land reports and believed in them with the fervor of a man who needed to believe in something. She told him about the first winter, which had been terrible, and the second winter, which had been worse, and the spring after Thomas died, which she still could not fully describe except to say that she had not known until then exactly what she was made of. "Now you know," Bernard said. "Now I know," she agreed. He looked at her in the early dark, and she was looking out at the plains, and the lamplight from the window behind them caught the line of her profile, and Bernard thought, with perfect clarity and no additional drama, that he was in love with Naomi Langston. He did not say it, not that night, because it was a thing that wanted to be said properly, and he was not yet certain she was ready to hear it, and he was not a man who said important things before he was sure of them. Instead he said, "I think the South Cattle pasture needs a new salt block," she said. "I put it on the list." And they sat a while longer in the comfortable dark. Ruth Caldecott came by the next weekend and managed to corner Bernard in the barn while Naomi was collecting eggs from the henhouse. Ruth was not a woman who wasted time on preamble. "You're in love with her," she said. Bernard continued oiling the harness he was working on. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Caldecott." "I've known that girl for 3 years," Ruth said, unperturbed. "I've watched her keep this place alive with nothing but stubbornness and hard work. I've watched her cry exactly once in my kitchen when she thought no one was counting. She doesn't let people in." "I know," Bernard said. "But she's letting you in," Ruth said. "Slowly, carefully, in the way she does things." Bernard looked up at her. "I know," he said again, and it was not a deflection. Ruth studied him with the direct assessment of a woman who had learned to read people the way farmers read weather. What she saw appeared to satisfy her. "Don't hurt her," she said simply, and walked back out of the barn and across the yard to help Naomi with the eggs. The event that broke the careful wall they had been maintaining between what they felt and what they said happened on a June evening that began as an ordinary evening and turned into a thunderstorm of significant proportions. They had known it was coming. The sky had been building all day with the particular green-yellow light that Kansas summer storms announce themselves with, and Bernard had spent the afternoon securing everything that could be secured, and Naomi had moved the chickens and checked the barn latch and brought in the laundry from the line with the efficiency of someone who had learned the prairie's moods. When the storm broke, it broke hard. Lightning over the flats, and then immediately thunder, no delay, meaning the storm was directly overhead, and rain that came down not in drops but in a solid, roaring wall. Bernard made it to the porch just as the rain arrived, which meant he made it to the porch drenched, and Naomi opened the door and pulled him inside with a practicality that had nothing to do with anything except getting the man out of a lightning storm. She threw him a towel from the hook by the door. He caught it. They stood in the kitchen while the storm pounded the windows and the lamplight flickered, and the house felt very small and very warm in relation to the violence outside. "I'll get dry clothes," she said, meaning she had some of Thomas's stored things, but she stopped halfway across the kitchen and turned back. "Actually, you're not the same size. Thomas was smaller." "I'll dry," Bernard said. He was already toweling off his hair, which was a state of dishevelment she had not seen before, and she found herself looking at him in a way she hadn't intended to make visible. He noticed. He lowered the towel. They stood about 6 feet apart in the small kitchen with the storm as loud as a rushing river outside, and there was a particular quality to the moment that was different from the previous moments of almost, different from the porch darkness and the cinnamon tin and the brief shoulder contact in the henhouse. This was more direct. There was nowhere particular to look except at each other. "Naomi," he said. She waited. "I want to tell you something, and I want to say it plainly because I don't think you would respect me for anything less than that." "All right," she said. "I came to this farm with a business purpose," he said. "And I want to be clear that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the mortgage or the land or any of that. If you want, I will tear up the note tomorrow and make it a gift and go, and that will be the end of the business. But I think you deserve to know that the reason I haven't gone anywhere, and the reason I don't want to, has nothing to do with the farm." She was very still, watching him. "I am in love with you," he said. I don't say it to put pressure on you or to change the arrangement or to claim anything I haven't been given. I say it because I believe you are the kind of person who deserves to know when someone thinks that about them, and because I think it would be dishonest of me to share your table and your evenings and not say it. The storm rattled the windows. The lamp flickered. Naomi looked at him for a long time, and Bernard waited, because he was a patient man, and because this mattered too much to rush. I buried a man I loved, she said finally, and after he died I decided that the farm was enough, that it would have to be enough. Because loving someone and losing them is a particular kind of damage, and I had spent a considerable amount of effort deciding I was not going to invite that damage again. I understand, Bernard said, and he did completely. And then you came here and bought my debt, she said, and I was furious about it, and then you were entirely different from what I expected, and every week since then has made it harder to maintain the decision I made. He was very still. I am not telling you it's easy for me, she said. I'm not telling you I don't have fear in it, but I'm telling you that I'm aware of what is happening and that I am not opposed to it. Bernard crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her, it was exactly the way she had imagined it might be, which was not with urgency but with something more thorough than urgency, with the kind of deliberate attention he gave to everything, as though she was something he intended to do properly. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, in the small, warm kitchen, Naomi Langston stood with her hands against Bernard Abbott's chest and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the particular weight of her shoulders releasing. They did not behave recklessly with what they had found. They were both too seasoned for recklessness, and there was too much at stake on both sides for anything careless. What had changed was simply that the feelings were now acknowledged, which changed the color of every shared moment without changing the substance of how they spent their days. They still worked. They still talked about cattle prices and crop rotation and the state of the south pasture fence. But now, in the evenings on the porch, he sat closer. Now, when she handed him the coffee cup, their fingers sometimes met around the handle, and neither of them moved away. Now, when he made her laugh, which she found he could do with an unexpected, dry wit she hadn't anticipated, she didn't moderate it, and the sound of her laugh became one of his primary organizing principles for the day, something he worked toward without quite admitting it. In July, Ruth Caldicott's husband Frank drove up with a load of lumber he said he had left over from his barn expansion and didn't have use for, and it took Bernard about 10 minutes to figure out that Ruth had most likely pressured Frank into buying extra lumber specifically, so she would have an excuse to drive it over. He said nothing about this to Naomi, only thanked Frank sincerely and put the lumber to use immediately, framing in the addition to the barn that had been on the list since April. Frank Caldicott was a quiet man who expressed approval through participation rather than words, and the fact that he stayed 2 days to help with the framing said more than a speech would have. Bernard worked alongside him with the easy camaraderie of men who communicate through the quality of their labor, and on the evening of the 2nd day, sitting on the half-finished barn wall watching the sun go down, Frank said without preamble, "You planning to stay?" Bernard looked at the farmhouse, where the lamplight was coming on in the kitchen window and the faint smell of supper was drifting across the yard. "Yes," he said. Frank nodded once. "Good." That was the entirety of the conversation, and it was sufficient. The complications Bernard had been anticipating from Silas Greer arrived in a more organized form in late July, in the shape of a letter delivered through the county clerk. Silas had engaged a lawyer in Wichita to contest the sale of the mortgage note, claiming that Percy Grimes had not had the full legal authority to transfer it without Silas's formal consent, which was, as Bernard discovered when he got his own legal advice, an argument with approximately no merit, but with the capability of creating expensive delays if pursued. Bernard rode to Caldwell and spent 2 days methodically building the documentary case that would be needed. He had the sale papers, which were clean. He had the county recorder's filed copy. He had Percy Grimes's signature on a clarifying affidavit, which Percy had provided with the resigned air of someone who had hoped not to be called upon again, and was not particularly surprised that he had been. He sent the complete file to a lawyer in Topeka whom he had been recommended to by a reliable source, accompanied by a letter that was polite, detailed, and entirely confident. When he came back to the farm, Naomi was waiting on the porch. She had known where he'd gone because he had told her everything. "Will it work?" she asked. "The claim has no legal foundation," he said. "It will be resolved in our favor. It may take until October." She was quiet for a moment. The evening light was warm and gold across the fields. "I want to be able to pay you," she said. "Not because I don't trust you, but because I want the farm to be mine, fully mine. I think you understand that." "I do," he said. "We will make it yours." And the way he said "we" was not accidental, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything further about it that evening, but it settled between them with the solidity of something agreed upon. The wheat harvest in August was better than either of them had anticipated. The summer had been kind enough rain, not too much, and the soil along Bluff Creek proved to be as good as advertised. Bernard had negotiated a favorable arrangement with a grain buyer in Caldwell whom he knew from his cattle driving days, a straightforward man named Hector Vance, who gave honest weights and fair prices, and the final harvest payment was sufficient to make a substantial payment against the mortgage note. Not enough to retire it completely, but enough to make the remaining balance manageable over 2 seasons. He spread the ledger on the kitchen table the evening after the payment came in, and Naomi sat across from him, and they went through the numbers together. When she saw the remaining balance, she was quiet for a moment, then nodded with the precise expression of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has just discovered it is lighter than it was. "2 more good seasons," she said. "1 if the cattle prices hold," he said. "The spring calf count is good. If we can hold them through winter properly and sell in March, it closes the gap." "We would need to get through winter properly first," she said. "The barn addition is done. The hay store is full. The house roof is solid. We'll get through winter properly." She looked at him across the table, and what she felt in that moment was something she recognized clearly now. Not the tentative, frightened feeling of the first weeks, but something rooted and sure, something that had been tested against the daily reality of working land and building plans and standing together against people like Silas Greer, and had held. "Bernard," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "I would like to know what you see," she said carefully, "when you think about the future." "Not the farm's future, yours." He set his pencil down. He looked at her with those riverstone eyes that she had spent the summer learning to read, and what she saw in them now was clear and direct and entirely undefended. "I see this," he said. "This table, this farm, you," she swallowed. "Even after the note is paid, even when there's no more business arrangement to maintain." "Naomi," he said, and his voice was low and gentle and completely certain. "There has been no business arrangement in my mind since approximately 3 weeks after I arrived. I have stayed because I want to be here, with you. I want to build something here if you'll allow it. I want to be on this land with you not as a creditor or a hired hand, but as a man who loves the woman who owns it." She pressed her lips together and looked down at the ledger and then back up at him. Her eyes were bright and she didn't look away. "Ask me properly," she said. He came around the table and she rose, and he took her hands in both of his, and it was not an impulsive thing but a considered one, and it was exactly right. "Naomi Langston," he said, "I would very much like to be your husband if you will have me." She looked at him for one long searching moment, during which the lamplight moved softly on the wall and the late summer night came through the open window, and then she said, "Yes, Bernard Abbott, I will have you." He kissed her hands before he kissed her, which made her smile, and it was the smile he had been working toward since April, the full one, unguarded, that transformed her face into something that knocked the breath right out of him. They were married in September of 1878, in the yard of the Bluff Creek farm on a day that was almost cartoonishly beautiful, with a blue sky, and the cottonwoods along the creek running gold with the season's first change. Ruth Caldecott cried through the entire ceremony with the unembarrassed freedom of a woman who had earned the right to her emotions, and Frank shook Bernard's hand with both of his, which was Frank's equivalent of a standing ovation. A small gathering had come, a handful of families from nearby farms, Hector Vance from the grain buyer's operation in Caldwell, and Pastor Mills, who had ridden out from town to perform the ceremony, and stayed to eat Ruth's contributions to the celebration dinner with considerable enthusiasm. Naomi wore a dress she had remade from fabric stored carefully in her trunk, an ivory cotton with small blue flowers that she had worn to a spring gathering years before and had saved because she liked it, and it fit her now exactly as it had then. And Bernard, when he saw her cross the yard toward him, had a moment of purely struck stillness that made Frank Caldecott, standing beside him, suppress a smile. When the vows were said and the guests had eaten, and the evening was coming down with its particular September softness, Bernard and Naomi stood at the edge of the creek field as the light went amber, and the guests moved toward their wagons and horses in the gentle dissolution of a good celebration. She was still in her wedding dress, which was impractical given that she had earlier helped shift 3 hay bales to clear space for the dinner tables, but which she wore with the ease of someone comfortable in her own life. "Happy?" he asked her. She looked at the farmhouse with its lamplit windows, the solid new barn, the fields that had given well this year and would give again, the creek glinting in the last of the light. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said, genuinely, substantially happy. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they stood there until the light went, and it was one of those moments that neither of them ever forgot. The legal matter with Silas Greer was resolved in October, as Bernard had predicted. The Topeka lawyer's response to Silas's Wichita lawyer's claim was apparently so thorough and so unambiguous that the matter was dropped without proceeding to any formal hearing, and the final notice of resolution arrived on a Tuesday morning very similar to the Tuesday morning, 6 months earlier, on which the deed had first arrived in Bernard's hands. He read the notice, folded it, and set it on the kitchen table for Naomi to see when she came in from the garden. She read it, set it back down, and said, "Good." Then she went back to the garden, and Bernard went back to the cattle pasture, and that was the end of Silas Greer. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was harsh in the way Kansas winters were harsh, not spectacular or legendary, but persistent, grinding, the kind of cold that settled in and intended to stay and tested the quality of your preparations and your patience equally. But the preparations were good. The hay store held. The cattle got through with no losses. The house was warm, and the long evenings were, Bernard thought, among the finest he had ever spent reading by the fire with Naomi, or playing cards, or simply talking with the particular ease of two people who have no more performances to maintain with each other. He discovered things about her that surprised him pleasantly and constantly. She had strong opinions about literature and was not shy about them. She could do mental arithmetic faster than he could, which she occasionally demonstrated with a composure that bordered on theatrical. She had a talent for sketching small, precise drawings of the farm and the land around it that she did in a notebook she kept on the shelf, and when he found it and looked through it, she watched him look without embarrassment, because she had decided that being known was not the same as being vulnerable. She was funny, in a way that was quiet and dry and arrived unexpectedly, and she was kind, not in a performance of kindness but in a practical, attentive way that expressed itself in small, consistent acts. The exact coffee, the repaired coat she worked on without mentioning while he was in the barn, the fact that she learned what made him laugh and occasionally deployed it precisely. He was learning, also, the particular textures of sharing a life with someone rather than simply admiring them from the careful distance of the porch. It was sometimes difficult. They disagreed, occasionally with heat, about the cattle management and about money, and once, memorably, about the best route for a new fence line in the north pasture. And while neither of them was a shouter, they were both direct and stubborn, and neither was inclined to concede without being genuinely persuaded. But the disagreements had a shape to them. They arrived, were argued, were resolved, and they departed, leaving nothing behind them except occasionally a slightly improved plan. He had never been in a relationship where conflict felt like a functional part of the mechanism rather than a sign of structural failure, and he found he valued this more than he had anticipated. By spring of 1879, Naomi was expecting their first child. She told him on a morning in March when the first real warmth was coming back into the land, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, looking at him with an expression that was simultaneously calm and filled with something that she rarely let fully to the surface. Bernard set his coffee down. He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she leaned against him, and they stood like that for a while without speaking, because this was not a moment that needed words. "Are you afraid?" he asked, eventually into her hair. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "A little." "Good," she said. "We'll be afraid together and manage it properly." He laughed quietly, which she felt against her. "Yes, that is exactly what we will do." Ruth Caldecott, when she was informed, cried again, this time with an enthusiasm that suggested she considered this development personally vindicating, as though she had been involved in arranging it, which Bernard reflected privately was not entirely inaccurate. The spring cattle sale went well. Hector Vance bought the calves at a price that made the mathematics of the mortgage repayment very straightforward, and in April of 1879, Naomi Abbott, she had taken his name with the matter-of-fact practicality she applied to everything that required a decision, sat down with the ledger, and wrote the final payment against the Bluff Creek mortgage note. Bernard witnessed it. The figure that had been hanging over this land for 3 years, the note that Silas Greer had used to threaten and pressure and ultimately try to take what didn't belong to him, was paid in full. Naomi blotted the ink, closed the ledger, and looked at Bernard with an expression of quiet triumph that he thought was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen on a human face. "It's mine," she said, "fully mine." "Ours," he offered. She considered him. "I was being precise for a moment." "I know, be precise. It's yours. I didn't have any doubt it would be." She reached across the table and took his hand. "It's ours," she said, "fully ours, more precise." The letter to the county recorder went out the next morning, along with the payment receipt and the formal satisfaction of the mortgage, and the Bluff Creek farm was, from that day, owned outright by the family of Bernard and Naomi Abbott, free of debt, clear of encumbrance, and productive in every sense of the word. Their son was born in October of 1879, on a day that was clear and sharp with early autumn, and they named him Thomas, for the man who had loved this land first and built the foundation on which they were building. Ruth Caldecott attended the birth with the competent cheerfulness of a woman who had assisted at many of them, and Bernard spent several hours in the barn making work for himself that didn't need doing and emerged when Ruth appeared in the barn door to tell him it was done and they were both well. He went to the room where Naomi lay with the child, and she looked up at him with the particular exhausted, luminous expression of a woman who has just done something extraordinary, and she held out the bundle in her arms, and Bernard took his son and sat down beside the bed, and looked at the small red face of Thomas Abbott, and felt something that had no precedent in his previous experience, a feeling so large and complete that it seemed to reorganize everything, to make the world larger and smaller at once, to make every previous understanding of what mattered shift and resort itself around this new and central point. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. Thomas Abbott made a sound that was not yet anything in particular but was entirely expressive. "He looks like you," Naomi said. Bernard looked up at her. "He looks like himself," he said. She smiled, the full one, the unguarded one, and reached out and put her hand over his where it held the child. "He does," she agreed, "but a little like you." The years that followed were full ones. Bernard became known in the county as a reliable man whose opinion on cattle and land management was worth seeking, and he gave it when asked with the same plain directness he gave to everything. Naomi continued to expand the farm's operations. She added a small kitchen garden that became a larger one that eventually supplied not just the household but a modest arrangement with the general store in Caldwell. And she kept her own accounts with a precision that the man at the bank who processed the deposits came to expect and respect. She also started teaching, informally at first, a few children from neighboring farms whose parents had little formal education, and who came on 2 mornings a week to learn reading and arithmetic at the Langston table, because Naomi had her father's view of education as a thing that should not be withheld from anyone who wanted it. Bernard built her a proper schoolroom off the south side of the house in the summer of 1881, because the kitchen table had run out of room, and by that autumn she had 11 students. By the following spring it was 15, and a conversation had begun in the area about the possibility of a formal school, which Naomi approached with the same combination of practical planning and patient stubbornness she brought to all worthy projects. Ruth Caldicott's health declined gradually through 1882, which was a grief that arrived slowly and was therefore in some ways harder than the sudden kind. Naomi drove over to the Caldicott farm 2 mornings a week through the winter and into spring, and Frank, who had never been a man of many words, expressed his gratitude to Bernard one afternoon simply by standing beside him at the fence and not saying anything for a long time, which Bernard understood completely. Ruth died in May of 1882 in her own bed, with Frank beside her and Naomi close, and the loss was real and was mourned properly, and it settled into the life of Bluff Creek Farm as all true losses do, not erased, not overcome, but carried forward with love. The formal school came together in the summer of 1882, backed by a petition that Naomi had organized and presented to the county board with the cool efficiency of someone who had done her research and was prepared for every objection. The county agreed to fund a teacher's position, which Naomi took, because she was already doing the work, and she was better at it than the alternatives presented. The schoolhouse was built on a plot donated by the Caldicott farm. Frank had offered it when he heard the plan, which Naomi suspected was his particular way of honoring Ruth, and she accepted it in exactly that spirit. Thomas Abbott started at the Bluff Creek School in the fall of 1883, at the age of 4, which Naomi maintained was not nepotism but efficiency, and Bernard maintained with a straight face that he agreed entirely. Thomas was an observant, cheerful child who had his father's stillness and his mother's precision, and managed to be simultaneously very much himself, which they were constantly and pleasantly surprised by. He had a gift for figures and a tendency to explain things to other children whether or not they had asked for the explanation, which Naomi recognized with a mixture of amusement and recognition as something inherited. A second child arrived in the spring of 1884, a girl they named Ruth, because the name belonged with them and needed to be continued forward. Ruth Abbott arrived noisily and with obvious intentions, and by the time she was 2 months old it was apparent she was going to have a personality that would exceed available spaces throughout her life, which Naomi faced with equanimity and Bernard with the specific joy of a man who has discovered that what he thought he wanted and what he actually wants are different things, and the actual thing is considerably better. By the mid-1880s, the Bluff Creek Farm had become something that even Bernard, with his careful management of his own expectations, had not quite anticipated when he had bought the deed to a stranger's debt in a converted storeroom in Caldwell 7 years before. It was not large by the measure of some operations, but it was whole. The fields were productive. The cattle were good stock. The house had been added to twice and showed it, in the way that houses that grow with families show it, not in grandiosity, but in rooms with different purposes and worn paths between them. There was an evening in the autumn of 1885 that Bernard thought about often afterward, not because anything of particular note happened during it, but because it contained, in miniature, everything he valued. Thomas was 6 and had been tasked with helping sort the dried beans from the summer harvest, which he was doing at the kitchen table with methodical attention, while also explaining to his 2-year-old sister the proper taxonomic distinctions between different types of legumes, which she was listening to with the polite tolerance of someone who has not yet decided whether to be interested. Naomi was at the stove, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of supper, and the low October sun was coming through the window and catching the dust motes moving in the warm air, and Bernard sat in the doorway of the kitchen from the outside, having come in from the evening pasture check, and he just stopped for a moment. He stopped and looked at it, the children at the table, his wife at the stove, who turned at that moment and looked at him with a small, direct smile that was only for him, that didn't reach the public version of her face but went straight to the private one. The warm room, the sound of Thomas explaining kidney beans to Ruth with the earnestness of the newly educated. Bernard had come to Kansas to stop moving. He had come to buy something that couldn't be taken from him on the back of a horse. He had done that, and had gotten, in addition to all of it, something he had not known he was looking for, which was the particular feeling of being completely, unself-consciously at home. He came in from the doorway, and Naomi handed him the coffee without being asked because she had heard him come up, and Thomas looked up from the beans with his father's steady eyes and his mother's precise attention and said, "Papa, did you know that these beans were from the 3rd row of the south garden specifically?" "I did know that," Bernard said, sitting down. "Mama marked them," Thomas said approvingly. "For replanting, the 3rd row ones are the best." "Your mother is thorough," Bernard said. Naomi from the stove said, "Your father would know since he helped put in that row." Thomas absorbed this with the satisfaction of a child who has received confirmation of an already favorable opinion. Ruth, having apparently decided that the bean lecture was over, climbed from her chair with focused determination and into her father's lap, where she arranged herself with the complete confidence of someone who considers this space personally reserved. Bernard put his arms around her and looked across the kitchen at Naomi, and she looked back at him, and in the look was everything. The spring morning in 1878, when he had ridden up to find her on the porch with a rifle and an unyielding jaw, and the first cup of coffee on the barn post, and the thunderstorm night in the kitchen, and the cinnamon tin, and the wheat harvest, and Sela's Greer ridden off down the road, and the wedding in the yard with Ruth crying happily. And the morning Thomas had been born, and every evening on the porch watching the Kansas light change. It was all in it, compressed into a look that lasted 2 seconds and contained years. "Supper is ready," she said. "Good," he said. "I'm hungry." She smiled again, the same smile, the private one. "You always are." Thomas set the beans aside with precision and helped his sister down from Bernard's lap with the serious responsibility of an older sibling, and the Bluff Creek family sat down to supper in the warm kitchen with the autumn dark coming down outside and the lamp burning steadily on the table, and it was exactly, in every particular, what a life was supposed to be. The formal Bluff Creek School had grown to 23 students by 1886, and the county had added a second teacher, a serious young woman named Helen Price, who had trained in Topeka and who, Naomi told Bernard with quiet satisfaction, was excellent, which was the only quality Naomi felt was non-negotiable. Together they ran a school that parents in the area valued, and children, somewhat to Bernard's ongoing amusement, seemed to genuinely like. Naomi had a gift with young people that was specific and real. She was not soft or indulgent with them, but she was interested, genuinely, in how each of them thought, and children recognized the difference between performance and reality at a biological level, and responded to her accordingly. One afternoon that fall, a young family arrived at the farm. A man named Joseph Reeves and his wife Clara, who had bought the property 3 miles east along the creek that had been empty since the previous owners had given up and gone back to Missouri. They came to introduce themselves in the direct neighborly tradition of the frontier, and they brought a child, a girl of about 4 named Alice, who stood very close to her mother's skirts and looked at everything with enormous dark eyes. Naomi brought them in for coffee, and Bernard and Joseph talked land and cattle and the particulars of the eastern pasture soil, which Joseph was worried about and Bernard could offer some experience on. Clara helped with Thomas and Ruth, who were in an energetic afternoon state, and Alice gradually unfolded from the skirt proximity until she was sitting beside Thomas and looking at the beans sorting with interest. When they left with a firm arrangement to ride over the following Saturday so Bernard could look at the eastern soil concern, Naomi stood at the door and watched them go down the road in the last of the afternoon light. "They'll stay," she said. "I can tell." "What makes you say so?" Bernard asked from beside her. "She has the same expression I had," Naomi said, "when I first arrived here, the one that means you've decided this is where it is. You might not know it yet, but you've decided." Bernard looked at her. "Is that how you looked?" "Probably," she said, "although you didn't see me for several more years." "I've been trying to catch up ever since," he said. She took his hand in hers where they stood in the door, and they watched the Reeves family wagon get smaller down the road until it turned at the Cottonwood Bend and went out of sight. There was a morning in the winter of 1887 when the farm was buried in snow and the world was still and white and enormous, that Bernard woke before dawn and could not sleep. He dressed quietly and went out to the porch in the pre-dawn dark and stood looking at the snow-covered fields, and he thought about the path from that Tuesday morning in Percy Grimes's office to this moment, the specific, improbable arc of it, the accident of it, which was not an accident at all but a sequence of choices, his and hers both, made at moments that had not announced themselves as pivotal. He had bought a deed to a debt because the mathematics were sound and the land was good. He had not known the woman behind the mathematics. He had not known Naomi, had not known that she would meet him on the porch with a rifle and a steady jaw, had not known that her honesty would be the first thing to take him off his footing, had not known that she would make him coffee on a barn post the morning after, and that it would mean something specific that he was already translating correctly, had not known any of it. And everything he had thought he knew about himself, that he was a man who kept moving, that what he wanted was land and quiet and nothing more complicated than that, that he had used up his capacity for anything resembling home when his brother died on a river crossing in 1871. All of that had been revised by a woman who had grown into this land like the cottonwoods grew into the creek bank, and who had, with patience and honesty and a dry humor and an absolute refusal to be less than what she was, shown him that his previous self-understanding had been a rough draft. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a deep cold blue. He could see the smoke starting from the Reeves farm chimney 3 miles east, just visible above the cottonwood line. He could hear, from inside the house, the first small sounds of the children beginning to wake. He heard the door open behind him. Naomi came out with a blanket around her shoulders and stood beside him, looking at the white fields. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. What were you thinking about?" He turned to look at her, this woman who had become the central fact of his existence, who had changed everything he thought he knew, who stood beside him now in the dawn cold as unself-consciously as breathing. "About how it started," he said. "About how I bought a piece of paper and had no idea what I was actually doing." She considered this. "The paper turned out to be relatively unimportant," she said. "The paper was the whole reason I came here," he said, "and the most unimportant part of any of this." She leaned her shoulder against his. The light was coming up now, pink and cold, the snow turning from blue-white to gold-white as the sun cleared the horizon line. "I'm glad you bought it," she said. "The paper. I was furious at the time, but I'm glad." "So am I," he said, "every single day." She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, and they stood on the porch of the Bluff Creek farmhouse and watched the sun come up over the Kansas plains, and the farm spread out before them in the new light. The fields and the barn and the garden and the creek line, and the new fence posts along the west pasture, and the schoolhouse roof visible just above the cottonwoods to the south. All of it built from that original, improbable beginning. From a fold of papers in a leather satchel, and a woman on a porch, and two people stubborn enough, and honest enough and brave enough to let something real take root. Thomas opened the front door behind them with the directness of a 7-year-old who has decided morning has occurred and everyone should know it. "It snowed more," he announced. "We noticed," Naomi said. "Can we check on the cattle?" "After breakfast," Bernard said. Thomas considered this with the brief, practical calculus of someone weighing hunger against enthusiasm. "Can breakfast be fast?" "No," said his mother. "Yes," said his father. Naomi turned to look at Bernard with a very specific expression. "A reasonable speed," Bernard revised. Thomas, satisfied with this outcome, went back inside, already calling to Ruth that there was more snow. Naomi looked at Bernard, and the expression became a smile, and the smile became a laugh, low and unguarded, and Bernard Abbott stood in the cold morning on the porch of his home and thought that this, exactly and specifically this, was everything. The breakfast was at a moderate speed. The cattle were checked and were well. The children played in the snow in the afternoon, while Bernard repaired a buckle on the harness, and Naomi graded the spelling worksheets from the school's Thursday session by the fire inside. And later that afternoon, the Reeves came by on their way back from Caldwell and came in for coffee, and Joseph reported that the soil concern Bernard had assessed in October was improving exactly as expected, and Clara brought ginger cake she had made that morning. And Alice sat beside Thomas with the settled comfort of a child who has found a familiar landscape, and Ruth fell asleep on Frank Caldicott's old chair, which had come to them when Frank sold the Caldicott farm and moved to his daughter's inn. The spring after Ruth died, and which sat by the fire as a permanent piece of the family's furniture and its story. And by the time the Reeveses had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with her grading done, and Bernard sat across from her with the cattle ledger open between them, and the lamp burned steadily, and the snow continued outside in the dark, and the Bluff Creek farm on the Kansas plains in the winter of 1887 was completely, fully, unreservedly whole. Bernard closed the ledger. Naomi capped the ink bottle. They looked at each other across the kitchen table as they had looked at each other across so many versions of this same table over the years, and in the look was everything that didn't need to be said because it was already known, already lived, already carried in the daily substance of their life together. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. He turned down the lamp. The farm settled into the winter dark, and the snow fell soft and steady on the fields along Bluff Creek, and inside the house the fire kept its warmth, and the Abbott family slept.